So our next speaker is Professor Pat Leighten, who's also based at Duke University and of course is no less distinguished than Mark. Over the years she has produced an extraordinary array of publications, including standard texts on Cubism and a very important monograph on early 20th century Parisian painting and politics. She's also done a great deal of work on photography, and today she's going to talk about perhaps the most famous photographer of the 20th century, Henri Cartier-Bresson. So Pat Leighten.
Thank you so much for such a generous introduction. Well, you know, the opportunity to come to a conference on art and moral conscience is just something I've been waiting for my whole career, I think. So it's such an important subject, and it's so often ignored, it seems to me, in some ways. I think that what I'm going to do will address the way that artists are often viewed in terms that are actually alien to their social and political purpose. Something that I guess I might have I devoted my whole career to, kind of just rediscovering what it was that artists said that they were about or indicated in any number of ways, but that are then ignored in a kind of aestheticized discourse. That was my first book on Picasso, addressed that precise issue, and it was extremely controversial as a result. It was actually banned at the Museum of Modern Art in New York informally. The staff were told they were not allowed to read it. And so, of course, they all ran out and bought the book. It was great. It proved W.C. Field's comment that there's no such thing as bad publicity. So I assure you all that you shouldn't worry. And I think that I also share with this conference an interest in how art, ethics, and politics inform each other in the creative act. And I will agree, and we can talk about, you know, the controversy of such a statement. Again, that all art is political, so I'm really agreeing with Sarah in that. Okay, so Henri Cartier-Bresson, let me get to an image. This is a work of his from 1932 called Behind the Saint-Lazare Station, Paris. So Cartier-Bresson, I don't know if you know this image or if you know any of his images, but this is kind of a typical work of his that is associated in the literature with his own phrase, the decisive moment, the moment of taking the picture. But it's often misunderstood, I think. In fact, maybe I could say that it's almost always misunderstood. But so Cartier-Bresson is often known as the most famous photographer of the 20th century, absolutely. And partly, I think, because he's thought to be non-controversial. So I'd like to make him controversial. Richard Avedon, if you had a chance to see the YouTube, also called him the greatest photographer of the 20th century. So that's quite a glove being thrown down on his behalf. What he's known for most is his compositional perfection, which I think you can see here, the extraordinary balance of circles, curves, the leaping figure, that wonderful little spot of white between the heel of his shoe and the shadow of his shoe being reflected in the water. The fact that he's suspended in air, you can actually see in the distance that the leaping man echoes a poster of a leaping dancer. It's just tiny, but that little white square in the background is a poster on the wall of the station with a dancing figure on it. So he's known for these juxtapositions that brilliantly evoke momentary visual coincidences and reveal telling truths. I'm not sure quite what the telling truth is here, but I'll hope to come back to that. But often viewers in these discussions of him overlook his actual subjects. His own stated philosophy, which you would have heard him say if you had a chance to see the interview with Charlie Rose, centered, he called it ethical anarchism. He kept saying anarchism is an ethic. It's centered on the transformation of the individual, independent of the state, and free of bourgeois morality. And it represents a notion of the embodied and absolute individuality of human beings as fully present in the moment, making possible Cartier-Bressons for him, his ability to see and respond to events in the world, and resulting in his unique photographic vision. So I'd like to show you how that works. In 1952, he wrote an essay called The Decisive Moment, in which he talked about his discovery of the small handheld camera called a Leica in 1932. So it's a very light handheld camera with a kind of film that is fast enough to capture motion, which wasn't not true until in the 1890s. So it still felt relatively new in the 20s when the Leica was invented as a handheld camera. He said, "It became the extension of my eye, and I have never been separated from it since I found it. I prowled the streets all day, feeling very strung up and ready to pounce, determined to trap life, to preserve life in the act of living." So if we look at this example, as I said, we see this watery expanse of a flooded area. A man leaps the water, or attempts to, echoing the dancer on a poster at the center rear. The geometric tensions of the form seem very perfect and balanced. It monumentalizes the ephemeral moments of life and speaks powerfully to the contingent quality of 20th century life lived at speed. That was one of the things that seemed most new in the early 20th century, was speed. So Cartier-Bresson was born in 1908. He came of age in the interwar period and witnessed the rise of fascism, communism, and the Popular Front in France in an atmosphere of the growth of mass movements, mass political movements, and various theories of collectivism. He was very early on, he was a close friend of one of the descendants of Elisée Reclus, who was one of the major anarchist theorists in the early 20th, late 19th and early 20th century. So he was very early on exposed to the ideas of Reclus, who was an anarchist communist, or a communitarian anarchist would be another way to put that. So Cartier-Bresson described his own immersion at age 20 in Reclus' book, Evolution, Revolution, and the Anarchist Ideal, which is a notion of how society will have revolutions, but it still needs to evolve between revolutions in terms of education to become increasingly tolerant and cooperative and understanding, as well as knowledgeable, I suppose. So Cartier-Bresson developed an interrelated commitment to radical individualism and a parallel photographic practice that became his main form of resistance to both the authority of the state and the authority of the past in terms of inherited visual convention. He, later in life, immediately following World War II, where he was captured photographing in his unit in the French army. He was a photographer in the army. That was what he was assigned to do. And he was captured by the Germans in 1940 and was in a prisoner of war camp for 3 years. Eventually he managed to, actually he escaped 3 times, but he was caught the first 2 times. And then he managed to escape and dug up the camera and film that he had buried in a particular French farmyard, and then photographed the end of the war as a member of the resistance. So he really had quite an exciting life in that sense. There's more to say about that, but I don't have time. Anyway, so he, right after the war, founded what I'm convinced he thought of as an anarchist cooperative called Magnum. So it's often described as a photographic agency, and he would have gone through the roof to hear anyone say that, because an agency is a business where the photographers work for it. This was a cooperative where every artist involved would retain the copyright on their own work, and it was simply a loose organization that would help them connect with magazines around the world. So their idea was to provide humanist imagery to magazines and newspapers globally for the purpose of fighting colonialism, exposing state oppression, and influencing public opinion. So, in fact, they succeeded amazingly, dominating the imagery in publications like Life, Look, and Paris Match. So it had an enormous influence. He founded it with 3 other friends, and we can talk more if that seems interesting. First, I want to touch on the criticism of his work. So this is the cover of a journal called Rapouillot, as you can see. And then on the right is a work entitled Hier, France, 1932. The cover of Le Rapouillot is 1933, so this is typical of his as he gets off the ground as a photographer. These are both early. So it's really very interesting to think about how criticism follows national lines and prejudices. To the French, Cartier-Bresson is a photojournalist primarily, and the important thing is his subject matter. To Americans, he's primarily an artist, a photographic artist, and the important thing is his composition and what seem accidental results, but for their compositional perfection. As in this work here, where this bicyclist is speeding by an extraordinary geometric pattern of the railing on the stairway. The Museum of Modern Art's website, in a retrospective of 2010, begins, Henri Cartier-Bresson is one of the most original, accomplished, influential, and beloved figures in the history of photography. His inventive work of the early 1930s helped define the creative potential of modern photography, and his uncanny ability to capture life on the run made his work synonymous with the decisive moment. So to go back to look at the French version of him, they view him as a documentary artist or a documentarian, a documentary photographer, who has recently, for the French, become politicized as a result of an exhibition in, I think it was 2015. I'm sorry, I didn't write it down. But it was at a retrospective at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and it was coming off of a recent biography of him with an author named Pierre Assouline, who spent hundreds of hours with Cartier-Bresson late in his life, and presented a lot of new information. And so in the French exhibition, they kind of focused on his involvement with this journal, Ce Soir, which was actually a Communist Front newspaper. It wasn't officially connected with the French Communist Party, but kind of unofficially. So he was indeed involved with this. But the view given in this exhibition is that Cartier-Bresson was someone whose communist political engagement had transformed an apolitical surrealist artist into a pro-communist photojournalist working for the French Communist Party. Just prior to this, I should tell you that this work is, so it's the masthead of Ce Soir, with a series that they did on disappeared children. And showing you a photograph of the one of those covers, a photograph used on one of the covers of what seems to be a homeless child. And that date of that is 1937. That's when he started working for Sossuet. So prior to that, in 1936, France was nearly in revolt, with strikes, factories occupied by workers, and demonstrations aimed at forcing the government to implement reforms that had been promised during the election campaign for the Popular Front, who won the election in May of that year, 1936. And there was such an uprising that within weeks the government had to act very quickly, passing historic new laws and creating new institutions. So collective contracts, readjustment of wages, and minimum wage, paid holidays, and the introduction for the first time in human history of the 40-hour work week. These are things that had been agitated for across the later 19th century that finally came to be, and not just in law only, but in fact. So the photographs you're looking at here are entitled First Paid Holidays Ever in History. France, 1936, published in Sossuet, that was celebrating these facts. And you can see it's just a picture of someone fishing and a picture of people having a picnic. But the point is that it isn't just Sunday. It's actually a time when they're being paid for their work week with time off to have holidays. So it was an enormous moment in human history, obviously. So on the left is Marseille, on the right, Seville, Spain. These are 1932 on the left, 1933 on the right, so they're a little bit earlier, characteristic of his earlier work. So for Cartier-Bresson himself, as he said over and over again, both the aesthetic or the American interpretation of his work and the documentary or the French interpretation of his work were aspects of his photography that were essential. They both are together and they work together. So both the French and the American interpretations of his legacy fail to account for his own stated philosophy, which we will look at. So if you had a chance to hear the interview with Charlie Rose, then you know that he repeatedly said, "I'm an anarchist." That was in 2000, that interview, and it echoes numerous interviews that he's given over the years to people in which he always said, "I'm an anarchist, anarchism is an ethic," and where the interviewer would fail to follow up and try to get him just to talk about the photographs. It really becomes almost comic, the way that he resists what Charlie Rose is trying to do there. So Rose tries to call him a great artist to his face, and Cartier-Bresson says, no, I'm an anarchist fundamentally, and so that concept doesn't exist. So Rose changes the subject. And Cartier-Bresson brings it up again, saying, "I'm an anarchist." And this time, Rose finally says, "What do you mean?" And he says, "Anarchism is an ethic." And then Rose tries to interpret this in a way that is palatable to him, saying, "Oh, you mean it's an attitude towards picture making? Because aren't we in the ivory tower, and therefore we can't let real life, wash inside?" And he says it's a desire to stir things up. And Cartier-Bresson, who always has a ready sense of humor, says, "I plead guilty." Because he's responding to that direct statement. But finally Rose says, well, okay, what is, and how do you define an anarchist? And he says, it's a way of behaving, acting, loving, finally, mentally, spiritually, and eventually physically. He's just the whole thing. He says, but what is the attitude that an anarchist has? So evidently anarchism is an attitude. for Charlie Rose, and he says, fulfilling a necessity with oneself, dealing with compromises, and living, especially in this society, in a world collapsing. So he introduces the notion of critique and not just a kind of utopian, I'm focused on myself. So European libertarianism, and that is, it couldn't be more radically distinct from American right-wing libertarianism, but that is the word that was often used. So European libertarianism is at the center of his self-conception and photographic practice. These are a portrait on the left of Mikhail Bakunin, one of the more influential anarchist theorists of the 19th century. And on the right is Friedrich Engels' posthumous portrait of Max Stirner, which was an ink drawing also from the 1860s. And these were two people who were especially influential on Cartier-Bresson. So, but Cartier-Bresson frequently echoed one of Bakunin's major works, which was called God and the State, in which I believe, yes, that's where he said, if God existed, we would have to abolish him. One of the little mots from that. Stirner was the author of a work usually translated as The Ego and Its Own, which defined the self as embodied. Stirner saw what he called fixed ideas as pernicious abstractions constructed by vested interests to divert us from a focus on the cultivation of our own beings, our own personalities, free of social constraint. He viewed Christianity as the best example of these fixed ideas that divert us from reality by creating an artificial division between mind and body, but through fabrication of an ethereal realm of so-called pure spirit, composed of general ideas and concepts that divorce us from our corporeal being and desires. In The Ego and Its Own, Stirner repeatedly defined the self as embodied, as motivated by irrational sensations of physical desire, as part of the material world, and as a temporal being undergoing constant change, both physical and psychological. He identified the enemy of the individual as any institution or belief system, whether religious or secular, whether the church or the state, or any church or state, directing individuals away from their unique and fully embodied selves. His ideas led to what came to be called ethical anarchism. I mean, it led to a lot of things, but one strain was ethical anarchism, which was very strong between the two world wars. And the concept was the transformation of the individual, independent of the state and free of bourgeois morality. So these were key ideas for Cartier-Bresson. He was an outspoken atheist, saying, man invented God, not the other way around. In his book, The Mind's Eye, he talked about his relation between his photography and his anarchist thought, echoing Stirner's concept of embodied individualism. And I'll read you this quotation from Cartier-Bresson. To take photographs is to hold one's breath, when all faculties converge in the face of fleeting reality. It is at that moment that mastering an image becomes a great physical and intellectual joy. To take photographs means to recognize simultaneously and within a fraction of a second both the fact itself and the rigorous organization of visually perceived forms that give it meaning. It is putting one's head, one's eye, and one's heart on the same axis. It is a way of shouting, of freeing oneself, not of proving or asserting one's originality. It is a way of life. Anarchy is an ethic. So he repeats that same phrase. When he died at age 95 in 2004, a homage appeared in the newspaper Libération, published by the Confédération Nationale du Travail, or the National Confederation of Labor, which was or the CNT, I'll just refer to it as the CNT from here on, was a labor union with deep ties to the anarchist syndicalist movement. It was titled Death of an Anarchist, which was it should have been a really shocking claim. Maybe it was for the French at that time. And I want to read you part of the homage. The photographic genius that he was, known and recognized internationally, tirelessly answered those who asked him about his photographic compositions. Quote, "The technique has no importance. It's the photographer's point of view that matters." And Henri Cartier-Bresson never hid his point of view. On the contrary, he never missed an opportunity to let fly his war cry during interviews, "Long live Bakunin." The inverse of a death too, right? A convinced and declared libertarian, Henri Cartier-Bresson tirelessly photographed the world of labor, applying himself from 1931 on to denounce the alienation of humans before the machine. He was present in social struggles on every continent. It was because of his libertarian convictions that he enthusiastically agreed to join in the international demonstration for an autre futur, another future, organized by the CNT for May 1st, 2000. Of course, May Day being a celebration of labor. Within the framework of this demonstration, it continues, he exhibited 30 of his photographs chosen from among thousands in order to convey a libertarian view, in this case, his own. 5 themes were addressed: the condition of the worker, social struggles, state oppression, true socialism, which was the word anarchists freely called themselves, and another future, which is to say, freedom, poetry, love, humor. The CNT bids him a final farewell and will continue the fight for freedom, for another future unshackled from capitalism, from its injustices, and from its alienation. So this is the only thing I have ever found that acknowledges his own political perspective. And the exhibition was actually organized by him of his own work in a way to reflect the issues that the CNT was most involved with. So the rest of this, I want to just look at that exhibition at works in it. So this is the Surrealist Cartier-Bresson, which he included in the show. They are surrealist by virtue of juxtaposing surprising images and the way that they are focused in, and they seem to be at once mundane and mysterious. It's a kind of photographic equivalent. Maybe it'll be a little less offensive to comfort, I don't know. But they're both accidental and powerfully evocative at the same time, and framed in ways to emphasize their irrationality or the surprisingness of them. Ethical anarchism deeply informed the Surrealist movement itself well into the 1920s, and that includes early André Breton. So it was more influential than is often recognized. There's been some good literature on this in recent years. It emphasized the cultural politics of sexual liberation and individual freedom. Assouline, the biographer, said that Cartier-Bresson said he devoured the journal La Révolution Surréaliste, which was the official mouthpiece of the movement. And that for him, and I'm now quoting from the biography, the pages of this journal contained a permanent justification for all forms of rebellion against war, against obsolete rules, against anything that posed a threat to liberty. And he's saying that's what Cartier-Bresson told him. Later, the photographer wrote, "I owe an allegiance to Surrealism because it taught me to let the photographic lens look into the rubble of the unconscious and of chance." Anarchist sexual liberationism is central to his work, which included acceptance and celebration of homosexuality, cross-dressing, and other departures from the bourgeois norm. These two works are called Alicante in Spain, 1933, and shows prostitutes and a cross-dresser cooperating with the photographer in revealing aspects of their personal lives. They're grooming each other. This is not a public performance. Without the respect that Cartier-Bresson brought to the exchange, such frank openness and self-revelation couldn't have been achieved. Two more photographs of prostitutes in Veracruz, Mexico, where he went and lived for a year in 1934. He lived in a house with the African-American writer Langston Hughes in the red light district, and they became very friendly with many people in the district. And later, Hughes invited Cartier-Bresson to move to New York, and he lived in Harlem for a year, where he swears he was the only white person that he saw for a year, and he never left Harlem. I don't know, that sounds a little mythical to me, but the point is just that he got involved in and lived in that community. And so therefore, he was able to photograph the members of the community as an insider and not as an outsider, which is, I think, really evident in the photographs. It might seem that it's fortuitous that they would be so kind of open and friendly, but it's central to his anarchist conception of egalitarianism, predicated on utter respect for every person as an individual. So the photographs of the prostitutes in his Veracruz neighborhood reveal the women participating in the making of the picture, engaged, fully humanized, individualized. Their smiles are intimate, but they're far from salacious. In fact, the photographer is a friend. So to look at this Cnt Exhibition, it opens with a collage that he made in where's the date? 1931. And then a handwritten statement that was written towards another future. How am I doing on time? Because I'm not sure when we started. Okay. So what he writes here in this, the red thing that you're looking at there, he says, to photograph. It is to hold one's breath when all our faculties converge to capture fleeting reality. It is then that the seizing of an image is a great physical and intellectual joy. So he writes that there, and it puts the Surrealist Collage there, which is entitled For Love and Against Industrial Labor, suggesting that the machine takes over all aspects of life. You can see how large it is in comparison with the figure of the man. And it also suggests that love, both physical and emotional, is the proper form of resistance. On the left is a work called Cuba from 1963, and on the right is the Citoyen factory in Paris, 1959. So he chose photographs from across his career. And he juxtaposed the photographs with quotations from Bakunin. So we have him actually putting anarchist theory together with his specific images. And you can hear how Bakunin's statements will echo the kind of thing we've heard from Cartier-Bresson as well. So the first, these two works were juxtaposed with a Bakunin quote. I am a fanatical lover of freedom, considering it as the unique place where the intelligence, the dignity, and the well-being of people can develop and grow. Not this freedom that is wholly formal, granted, measured, and regulated by the state, an eternal lie. So these photographs, you can see the way that the geometric forms play against the forms of the figure. And in both cases, the figures are kind of subsumed within the geometry of the machine. And in the Citoyen, I mean, the man's face is absolutely obliterated by a piece of the machinery, which would normally be considered a faulty photograph. If it were photojournalism, it would not probably get published, or mirror. And the other photograph we get a wonderful confrontation, a moment of connection between the worker and the photographer. Another of the Bakunin quotes juxtaposed here was, "The state was always the patrimony of any privileged class, priestly class, noble class, bourgeois class, finally bureaucratic class. When all the other classes being exhausted, the state falls or rises as you wish to the condition of the machine. The state is the authority, the domination, and the power exercised by the possessing and so-called enlightened classes over the masses. It always guarantees that which it contrives, to some their wealth, to others their poverty, to some the freedom founded on property, to others slavery, the fatal consequence of their destitution." And I point out that, including Cuba, emphasizes Cartier-Bresson's anarchist leveling of capitalists and communists after 1956. So that kind of reinforces the notion of his anarchism as opposed to his communism. On the left is a reception at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mexico City, 1963, and on the right, Wall Street, 1947. The Bakunin quote for these says, "Freedom without socialism is privilege and injustice, and socialism without freedom is slavery and brutality." So you can kind of interpret these photographs yourselves. In both of them, it's very interesting the way the architecture controls the figures. So these people think of themselves as free, but they're also trapped in their own particular role, although there's a lot of self-congratulation in the postures as well. These are two images from May 1968 in Paris. As industrialization becomes state power, as you can see on the left, in this photograph of the Paris police waiting in formation to break up a demonstration. They've been given their coup de rouge, which was a standard practice then, given a glass of red wine before the battle. So they're waiting with they're ready for a fight. They're in protective gear, carrying shields, etc. In the work on the right, you can see the kind of level of culture clash that May 68 also represented. A bourgeois man walking along is, very properly dressed, and he is struck by a graffito on the wall that says "Jouissez sans entrave." It just says "Have pleasure without limits," and which would be a very, the hippie aspect of the '68 revolution, so-called revolution, is a real culture clash again. And the Bakunin quote for these works is, "Liberty cannot and should not defend itself with other than liberty. And as ethics have no other source, no other stimulant, no other cause, no other object than liberty, and as ethics is itself nothing other than liberty, all the restrictions that one has imposed on morality with the aim of protecting it are always turned to its detriment." Of course, Cartier-Bresson was not alone in any way in connecting Bakunin with this May 68 event. And a last pair of images. On the left is a model prison of Leesburg, New Jersey, solitary confinement, 1973. On the right, Berkeley, United States, 1967. So, two forms of cruel experimentation and all too usual punishment. I love the fact that the prison is called a model prison for, trapped and vulnerable creatures. So he's fully critical of the scientized world of the prison and of animal experimentation. He was an environmentalist as well, which is not surprising. So he acknowledges his political position in making pictures like these in The Mind's Eye, which is a very well-known book. It's cited constantly in the literature on him. He says, Photography appears to be an easy activity. In fact, it's a varied and ambiguous process in which the only common denominator among its practitioners is their instrument. What emerges from this recording machine, which he has contempt for in his way, does not escape the economic constraints of a world of waste, of tensions that become increasingly intense, and of insane ecological consequences. And statements like that are just ignored. And in 1998, he wrote, "In a world that is buckling under the weight of profit-making, that is overrun by the destructive sirens of techno-science and the power hunger of globalization, that new brand of slavery, beyond all that, friendship exists, love exists." Now that is his philosophy. So just to come back briefly to this image we started with, I would just say again, the watery expanse of a flooded area. A man jumps to leap the water, echoing the dancer in the poster at rear. The geometric tensions of the form seem perfect. But now we can go further. The watery expanse is a flooded area under repair in a train yard. A man jumps. Ripples emanate from his point of departure on the ladder. We only see him airborne, but he is sure to land in the muck. We see that the geometric balance of this work is achieved first through the roofs of the train sheds in the back, the iron fencing and its reflection. Sorry, I lost my place. And a wheelbarrow. Where is that? That's harder to see. It's just behind the man. Piles of discarded building stone, a derelict ladder with its contingent ripples, and rusty barrel hoops lying in the flooded area. Despite the delightful, decisive moment that its superb composition conveys, this industrialized landscape is not actually more inviting than the other images of his that we've seen. But by aestheticizing it, we can manage not to notice. The setting was not accidental. He found this spot and waited. His vantage was so imperfect that he had to crop an out-of-focus post on the left. So he was hiding behind this post for someone to leap, because probably somebody else had already done it, and he saw it and realized what he could make. So it's one of only two negatives that he ever cropped. He was really not a kind of craftsman. He didn't print his own photographs. I mean, that's extraordinary, especially in the history of the artist photographer. That's almost unheard of. But he kept the 35 millimeter proportions by eliminating not just the left side, but then top and bottom. So he comes back to something that makes you think that it's just a 35 millimeter. But he was always frank about it. And what is unusual is that he bothered to perfect a work in this way. So I'm just going to read my conclusion. Given his many Bakunin-esque statements calling for the freedom of the individual as against slavery to the machine under capitalism, the figure seen against an industrial wasteland converts into a dancer celebrating life, love, and desire. The extraordinary achievement of the picture is to find so much beauty in such detritus, such joy in the leaping figure. This early work easily sums up his philosophy and operates as a vehicle for us to make that leap as well. As with so many other artists whose innovative work is visually powerful, we've come to overlook his actual subjects and the importance of their tension with the geometry of their shapes. As he warned, quote, "It is impossible to separate content from form." We need to remember this and his many claims to an ethical anarchist vision to understand his work from this more broadly theoretical and historical perspective. His photographic technique was an expressive vehicle for a vision of global humanity and for his belief that the photographic medium could be a means for overcoming prejudice and injustice. What actual impact his work may have had in changing people's minds with his persuasive vision of universal connection, visible in the work I've shown, but also in all of his work for Magnum, is yet to be evaluated. But I hope this may be a new way to look at his art. Thank you.